On the 10th of May 1941, Adolf Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess, parachuted into Scotland, landing in a field near Eaglesham. The prominent Nazi had flown solo for nearly 1,000 miles from Bavaria in a Messerschmitt, apparently on a peace mission in the days leading up to Germany's invasion of Russia. Nobody ever has come clean as to what that was all about, who knew what about it, and when did they know it. One thing we know, that 74 years ago, yesterday, the beast of Hitler fascism was utterly destroyed amongst the rubble in Berlin. Well, I say we all know it. All of us done certain age know it. All of us done certain age know that the 9th of May is Victory Day, but did you know it? Certainly you did not know it from the British media, from the British school system. A gigantic cover has been drawn over the circumstances of the defeat of fascism. We'll be asking why. Although you don't actually have to be Einstein to work out why, because although if not for us there wouldn't have been a Second World War, because if we had capitulated when we stood alone in 1941, it would have been all over, and Hitler and Hitlerism would have ruled the entirety, almost, of the European continent. And I'd be speaking to you in German, except I wouldn't, because I'd be dead already, because I'm one of those, Untermenschen, one of those subhumans that wouldn't have survived the cut. Now, the reason that we don't celebrate Victory Day is because the Russians won it. If not for us, it would have been all over in 1941. But if not for the Russians, then Hitler would never have been defeated. Don't take my word for it. Take Mr. Churchill's, who gave copious and repeated praise to the same effect. Now, it's really come to something, isn't it? When we're supposed to love Germany and hate Russia, that we're supposed to hate Russia so much we cannot even bear to recall the great wartime alliance of Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin, the United States, Britain, and the then USSR. I'll be asking why that should be. We'll be talking with the great Steve Topple, my old pal, about ME Awareness, a campaign that he is running. And it's a very personal matter to him. His lovely partner is afflicted by this very ailment. And I know that Steve will have plenty eloquent to say about it. We'll be talking about the UK economy. Do you remember when we were told in Project Fear, as we ran up to the Brexit referendum, that the mere act of voting to leave the European Union would bring the British economy crashing about our ears? Well, of course, the reverse has happened. The Q1 growth figures have just been published, and hey presto, Britain is doing better than the entire Eurozone, better than Germany, better than France, better than the Eurozone, behind only the United States and Canada. I think that's the third quarter running that league placing has been achieved. We'll be talking to an international economist and strategist, Dr. Gerard Lyons, about that. And because of Purdah, of course, we can't talk about the European elections in Britain, but we can talk about them in France. And that's why we'll be crossing the channel, 29 miles, I remind you, because sometimes it seems as if France is on the dark side of the moon, particularly on Saturday afternoons when hundreds of thousands of French people are battered and bludgeoned and tear-gassed by our friendly Napoleon Macron on the streets of France. Well, in the opinion polling there, the far-right rally, formerly the National Front, led now as then by Marine Le Pen has overtaken spring-heeled Jack Macron in the opinion polls. And the far right, the nationalists, the anti-globalists, the anti-Brussels forces seem to be poised for a sweeping victory all over the European Union. Taken together with us leaving the European Union, if we ever do, that adds up to a very considerable problem. But the burden of my opening remarks must be the gates of hell that may be about to be opened by Donald Trump at the incitement, capital I, of John Bolton and the neocon gang that couldn't shoot straight in the run-up to Iraq, who are now back in control of the president's brain, which would otherwise, it would seem, be missing. Maybe not. Trump, according to the New York Times, is furious with his officials for misleading him about the actual lay of the land in Venezuela, where Trump was told all we needed was to push and the regime in Caracas would fall over. And the United States led its allies, more fool them, on a schoolboy promenade into recognizing a guy in the street in Caracas as the president. Some of them kicking out the Venezuelan ambassador. Others of them, including ours, locking up, stealing Venezuela's gold in the Bank of England. Because, well, hey, there had been a regime change, hadn't there? Well, of course, there has not been a regime change. The fiasco, capital F, fiasco of Juan Guaido's attempted coup d'etat is now being laughed about in every barrio, in every country of Latin America. An utter, total fiasco. And soon, President Guaido will be just another gold-toothed emigre in Florida, fulminating and planning his revenge. Now, if your officials were lying to you, President Trump, about Venezuela, why do you think they're telling you the truth about Iran? In fact, Iran is such an uncomfortably close word to the word Iraq. Substitute only the last letter of the word. You ought to be very careful indeed. Because every commentator, columnist, junkie, political junkie, every neocon, hawk, every torag from the depths, from the bowels of the far-right neocon establishment in Washington is urging you to attack Iran. And you have now deployed your substantial naval assets to the Persian Gulf. So let me tell you, because I know you know nothing about it, President Trump, let me tell you about the Persian Gulf. Let me tell you that the Straits of Hormuz, through which the vast majority of the world's oil passes, are 7 miles wide, and Iran can block them at the snap of a finger. Let me tell you also that Iran is 80 million people. It is not like its neighbor Iraq, a broken-backed, sanctions-stricken, divided country. Iran is an entirely united country, at least when it comes to fending off the attacks of Uncle Sam and whomsoever is foolish enough to join her. Please believe me on that. Every Iranian, not just in Iran, but all over the world, including in Arizona, where many of them actually live, because I was at a polling station once during the Iranian presidential elections, and Arizona Iranians were flocking to the polling station to vote. Iranians all over the world will rally behind their country if you seek to harm a hair on its head. Let me tell you that Iran is an overwhelmingly young country. More than half, well over half of the population are young, under the age of 30. Iran is a powerful, strong country with a powerful military. It has the means, and above all, it has the will to fight you if you attack it. Please believe me on that, President Trump. I know what I'm talking about. And I told your predecessor, George W. Bush, not to do it in Iraq. And look how that turned out. But it will be much, much, much worse for you than it was for George W. Bush, because Iran is far more capable and willing of fighting back against you. And Iran has a religious echo around the world. And you will not just be fighting in the Straits of Hormuz, believe me. You'll be fighting Iran everywhere, or rather, they'll be fighting you everywhere. It will be an absolute cataclysmic catastrophe if you attack Iran. I say if, but you're already, in fact, attacking Iran. Your blockade has moved up from just being one of any number. I've lost count of the number of countries that the United States is now sanctioning. I really have lost count. Has moved up to a full-scale quarantine, a blockade which is itself an act of war. And so this war may actually start very quickly indeed, and it may be the Iranians that start it, because from their point of view, you're already at war with them. So I give you this advice. Tweet them, Mr. President. Tweet them and tell them that you want to talk to them. And do it without precondition. And do it without braggadocio. Do it without shaking your fist in faux orange anger. You better do it, President Trump, because if you don't, the rest of us, as well as you, will pay a price for as long as it's possible to see into the future. This is the mother of all talk shows. We're going over to France now, where tomorrow, yet another act in the long saga of the Yellow Vests' confrontation with the French state and little Emmanuel Macron will take place. And I'm no sage, but I predict a riot. But one man who is a sage is Adam Sage. He's the Times correspondent in France who watches all these matters. And I'm glad to say Adam's back on the show this evening. Adam, welcome back.
Hello. Nice to talk to you.
And you. Tell us first, if you would, about the elections there. I read that the renamed, rebranded, though maybe not all that different, French rally led by Marine Le Pen has moved ahead of Macron in the opinion polls. How's that all looking?
Well, that's right. I mean, the National Front as it was then and the National Front of the National Rally as it is now won the last European elections. They came out on top then, and she's very much hoping that they'll do the same this time. They're just ahead in the polls, and Emmanuel Macron is staking everything on his party, just pipping them to get ahead.
And is the left in the election? Has Mr. Mélenchon got a slate in action?
He's got a slate, but their polling figures are pretty bad. They're only around about 10%. The Socialist Party, who, as you might remember...
I'd forgotten about them.
Most people have, and they're pretty much under 5%, which means they might not even get any MEPs at all. So
Wow.
they're off the radar screen. It's looking very, very much like a head-to-head between Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron, which is how both of them want it to be. The only people who might be able to get a look in aside them are the centre-right Republicans.
Tell me the platform that Le Pen is standing on, would you?
Well, it's a platform that is a fairly traditionalist national front or national rally platform in terms of immigration, opposing immigration, and in terms of all those issues of integrating Islam or not integrating Islam into French society. It's slightly different to the extent this is the first time that they are officially running on a platform that doesn't call for France to leave the European Union. It says that the European Union needs reform, and of course, lots of reform. But they're not talking about a Frexit anymore. French exit. So that's quite a big shift for them towards the mainstream.
And is that the only trim that they've made? Because, of course, they've been fatally compromised in the past by the Vichy Nazi collaborationist past of her father and the intellectual antecedents of the party. What distance have they managed to put between themselves and that?
Marine Le Pen has been working very hard since she's come to power. She's come to take charge of the party from her father over many years to give it at least a veneer of respectability. She's managed to avoid all the anti-Semitic, outrageous anti-Semitic remarks that landed him in court that time and again. And she certainly has moved away from that Vichy collaborationist, overt Vichy collaborationist path. Now, some people would say that it's no more than a veneer and that deep down the party is the same. I think that there is a difference between her and her father. I don't think that she's anything like as toxic as he was. Whether that means that the rest of the party has changed is a moot point. But she certainly made big efforts to become respectable and to become electable.
Now, what about the Yellow Vests? There was talk of them fielding slates in the European Parliament elections. Did that happen?
Well, it sort of has happened, and there are various slates, but they're not. None of them. There's no unity amongst the Yellow Vests, and as soon as anyone says that they're going to run for in the European election campaign, they get pretty much massacred by all the rest of the Yellow Vest movement. I mean, it's a very diverse movement anyway, which goes from the far left to the far right. So it's very difficult for them to agree on anything. And at the end of the day, the first people who said they were going to run in the European elections, they no longer are because they were insulted so much on Facebook by everyone else. There are a few people here and there, but I don't expect them to have much influence, really.
And what about Brexit? How is it looking from France? There was an Elysée official quoted today basically telling the British to get on with it, though less politely than that, and making it clear that there's no possible extension beyond October 31. Macron has been harder than some of the other European Union leaders on this. Is there exasperation amongst the French about Britain?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think Emmanuel Macron, obviously, he came to power wanting to lead Europe to a new era. I mean, his party slate in the European election campaign is called the Renaissance slate, and that's pretty much what he hopes to do for Europe. And instead of that, he's found himself bogged down in these endless, obtuse and incomprehensible debates about Brexit. And I think he is really exasperated and fed up with it. That said, as you so rightly tell, he's taken a hard line throughout and made these sort of threats before. We're going this far and no more. I mean, in March he said that, in April he said that, and both time he had to beat a retreat in the face of Angela Merkel. So I think that probably France's hard line should be taken in that context. Yes, they've got a hard line, but France is only one of 27 countries negotiating with the UK, and at the end of the day, he has to agree on a position with Angela Merkel, who's not at all on the same line or hasn't been so far.
And of course, he'll likely be a reduced figure after these European parliamentary elections, especially if he comes second.
Well, I don't know. That's a very good question. I mean, a reduced figure to the extent that, yes, you would imagine that populist parties will do well across the Union, specifically in French terms. I mean, he's really up the ante, really up the stakes, saying that he wants to win. If he wins, if his party comes out on top, then I think that would give him a significant boost. And of course, the contrary is also true. If Marine Le Pen comes out on top, then yes, you will be right. He'll be a reduced figure. Now,
finally, I know you're not a big Yellow Vest man. I am. But from your point of view, and you're there, these, what is it now? It's more than 6 months. This is Act 25, is it, tomorrow?
Yeah, 17th of November it started, yeah.
Yeah. So Act 25, that's a long struggle, even by French standards, especially given the really rather rough treatment that the demonstrators are receiving and giving out to the police. The damage that's being done, the sheer attrition of it all. It's indefatigable, isn't it? The French thirst for protesting this. What's the public's view of it all?
I think that slowly the support is waning for the Yellow Vests. I mean, they've had a lot of sympathy and a lot of support so far, with more than 50% of people saying they back them. I think that there's a feeling now that Macron has made a series of concessions, twice, once in December and once last month, that it's gone on enough really now, and we're down to pretty much the hardcore of the Yellow Vests who've been joined by what we call the Black Blocs. I mean, effectively sort of a hardline left anarchist movement. So I think support is slipping away from them. Last Saturday there were very few people out, really, only a few hundred in Paris and only a few thousand around France. And it would be interesting, and I don't think anyone really knows to see how it's going to pan out over the next few weeks. One of the reasons that no one knows is it's a movement without a leader. It's a entirely grassroots movement that means that it's very difficult to predict where it's going to go, how it could stop, or even if it could take off again. It might do, and all those possibilities remain on the table.
Adam, always a pleasure. Thank you very much. Adam Sage, French correspondent of The Times. Andrew says we shouldn't be leaving Europe. We should be running Europe. If we can do it in football, surely we can do it in politics and economics. Well, we have been in it quite a long time, Andrew, and it hasn't quite worked out that way. My friend is back, the anonymous texter who listens every week and texts at great expense all night. It's a wonder your beloved Russia won the war after Stalin murdered so many of the military top brass in the purges. And then he capitalizes, remember Katyn Forest. Well, they were Poles, actually, that were murdered in Katyn Forest. And it is a wonder, yes, that Russia won the war after the military purges. A rare moment of agreement between us, Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. How can I tell? Charlie. No, I'm fed up of him. Tad. The trouble with countries rattling sabres is that the effect gradually diminishes to the point where the sabre has to be withdrawn from the scabbard to have the same effect. This is completely the wrong approach by the United States, but we might have expected such a foreign policy when Mr. Pastry became National Security Advisor. Dark times ahead, I fear. Regards, Tad. Thank you very much, Tad, one of our highly intelligent listeners here on the University of the Airwaves. Let's take an old friend of the show, Fra in Belfast. Go ahead, Fra.
Sorry, could you pass that on? Is that all right? It's something I have to tell me.
Fra, are you there? Let's go to a message and come back to him. Mountain Man says, is it true that America has been at war with someone for 222 years since 1776? And it looks like here we go again. Well, interestingly, you say that, Mr. Mountain Man. But the last year that Britain had no soldier fighting in the field in a foreign country was 1774. So that's even longer ago than 1776. Just imagine that. And your vegan coach says the only reason Mélenchon isn't polling higher for the European elections is because he's been trashed unrelentingly by the French media, very much the way Corbyn has by the UK media. I'm sure you're not surprised. I would like to hear more, though, about that. Adam didn't talk about the numbers. He did say that they were kind of neck and neck, the two big parties, Le Pen and Macron. And he did say that Mélenchon was only around 10%, and the Socialist Party may be less than 5%. I'd like to know what numbers Le Pen and Macron are sharing. Fra's back on a better line. Go ahead, Fra.
Thank you very much, George. Good
Welcome.
evening.
Evening to you, sir.
Thank you, George. Just if I could take maybe 2 minutes just to kind of create a wee bit of space just for what I want to say. I've recently travelled to the People's Republic of Luhansk, and if you remember, that's one of the two separatist regions, along with Donetsk.
Oh, yes.
The Donbass region.
How do you get there, by the way?
I went from Dublin to Moscow to Rostov-on-Don, and then over the border. It was a total journey of 31 hours from Belfast to the city of Luhansk. I had a 7-hour delay at the border. There were 13 internationals going on. It was an international round table with the foreign minister, and the foreign deputy minister, about how to fight fascism, which is why I really phoned in, George, because it ties in with the 9th of May.
Yes, Victory Day, yes.
Exactly, brother, exactly, 100%. So, look, with the 31 days of travelling, and I want to point out just a few things, like 50,000 people, George. There's a combined population of 1.8 million people in this region in Donbass, and there were like 50,000 people who on May Day went out to celebrate, you know, workers' productivity and to celebrate the workers' place in society. When I go on a May Day rally in Belfast, which obviously they've moved from the traditional 1st of May to the first Monday in the month and made it a bank holiday so people really forget the roots of the May Day celebrations, we're looking to get 500 people.
Mm-hmm.
So there were 50,000 people on the 1st of May. On the 2nd of May, and I could be corrected on this, but we were taken to some mass graves where they were remembering two incidents. One, which is when the Ukrainian soldiers were involved in violent clashes with the separatist movement within Luhansk. There's like 13,000 casualties, 13,000 dead, I believe, in the fight for separation between the people in those two new independent republics and the Ukrainian state. And what was kind of very much not drilled into me, it's the wrong word. What people really wanted to get out was that, you know what happened in Odessa? I think that was the 2nd of May, and I think that's why we were commemorating this, when burned the 48 people in the...
I remember, in the
building.
trade union office, yeah?
Yes, George. The murdered 48 people, and another 200 were injured, and we've all seen a wee bit like the collateral damage video that Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning managed to bring out into the public domain. In Odessa, there were people who jumped from the buildings and they were assaulted by fascists in the street. This is the one turning point that was stressed to me of why those people wanted to secede from the Ukrainian Federation, if that's the correct term, because they saw this fascist coup led from Maidan, which was followed up by the portraits of Nazi collaborators from the Second World War being hung from the parliamentary buildings. So I was shown a mass grave in Luhansk, which had hundreds of bodies from that war, conflict, fight for liberation, depending on how people want to describe this, where they buried the bodies quickly because the morgue was filled, and there's this old, you know, traditional worry that decomposing bodies in the street will lead to some form of disease within the community. So they were saying that what happened in Odessa and the fascist coup that they perceived in Kiev was a reworking of the Nazi collaboration aspects of some Ukrainians, and that this shows that the fascism, which you've alluded to, that the Russians fought, and I will go along with that the British fought during the Second World War, that that's what the people in the republics of Luhansk and Donbass claim that they have been fighting. They've been fighting a form of fascism, that you have this Azov brigade, and I know you've mentioned the jihadi brigade that's knocking about, and a friend we both have in common who was on one of the Viva Palestina convoys was in Odessa recently, because I followed her stuff on Facebook, and she saw a midnight rally as such with people carrying torches in Odessa, and some of the chants they were claiming were to hang the communists. So when you put that in with what's happening in France, the rise of the right in Hungary and Poland and some of the other previous Soviet satellite republics, surely there's a question here. Is fascism again to the forefront, violent fascism at the forefront of European politics? And will we need Russia? And I'm serious when I say this, and it's because I've been there. Will we need Russia again to defend those who do not want to live under the jackboot of fascism in Europe?
Well, a fascinating report of your trip there, Fra, and fascinating questions that you pose. As you know, I'm rather keen that we should call people what they are and not call them what they're not. So let's start with the Ukrainian coup regime. They are not all fascists, and indeed Poroshenko has just been humiliatingly dumped out of office by, I think, a 33-year-old actor whose only previous connection to politics was playing the president of Ukraine in a television soap. And he's Jewish. So a country with a Jewish president, 33 years old, cannot be written off in its entirety by any means as fascist. The Ukrainians are in the grip of nationalism, like many other countries in the former Soviet bloc and in the West. If Le Pen wins in France, it will be not because her father was a Nazi collaborator. It will be despite that. It will be because she is seen as, wants to be seen as, the epitome of French patriotism as defined against EU centralism, globalism, American domination in the form of the traditional Gaullist tradition. So right, east and west, nationalism is a thing, a very strong thing. Now, nationalism is not, of course, in itself fascist. Of course it isn't. But there are real causes for concern about fascism in Ukraine. First of all, the first act, the very first act of the coup, the armed, violent coup that overthrew the previous government in Kiev, was to outlaw the Russian language. Now, that might not strike everyone listening as all that important. Well, it is if 35% of the population of the country speak Russian. In a stroke, the Russian language was removed as an official language in the state, and thus more than a third of the population were automatically deemed to be second-class citizens, and that led to the upsurge and the creation of these so-called independent republics that you talk about. The second act of the coup regime was to appoint seven actual fascists to important government posts, ministries, ministers, people who jackboot around, who wear swastikas on their armbands, who worship a man called Stepan Bandera, who was a Nazi collaborator and a mass murderer of Jews and partisans that were fighting the Nazis, a man who openly collaborated with the Nazis. Bandera is now a national hero, literally, officially, in the Ukraine. War memorials to the Second World War were systematically desecrated, and the activities of the Nazi collaborators hailed as acts of great patriotism. So if Ukraine is not a fascist country, and it is not, it has a disturbingly large and important, salient number of fascists in important positions in the state. Now, we don't know what the new president will do. He's a Russian speaker, by the way, Fra. He's not only Jewish, he speaks Russian. He struggles in the Ukrainian language. So it may be that there are some causes for imagining that the power, influence, danger of the far right in Ukrainian politics may begin to abate. Last word to you, Fra.
Okay, brilliant analysis as always. I suppose the only rejoinder I would have is that the fascists in the Maidan were the people that were used in order to force through the coup.
Sure.
It was their violence, and it was their numbers on the street, and it was their attack upon the state apparatus and the state police that had such an influence on
Sure.
on forcing the agenda, which I would conclude was driven by America, and there were comments about like $5 billion.
And the European Union, by the way.
Happen overnight. Yes, George, because I think we would all agree that after the fall of the Soviet Union and NATO and America saying there would be no impingement on the Russian borders, there's nothing to worry about, the sleeping bear can sleep easily at night. We've witnessed, the successive bringing into the EU of like Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania and the Ukraine. If they're not in, they're going to be in, and they're, kind of semi members of NATO and stuff. So it's a genuine concern I have, because the people I spoke to who had fought against what they saw was this rise of fashion at this time in this particular region of the Ukraine. Those people were very, very, very concerned. And on the 3rd of May, I think it was, we saw the 2nd of May, a reenactment of the storming of the Reichstag. So they took a building in downtown Luhansk, and they had thousands of soldiers and people dressed up in uniforms that were contemporary of the time, and the rifles, and showed the storming of the Reichstag and the raising of the communist flag above the building. But it's street theatre. But at the same time, I said to somebody, do you do this every year? And they say no, but we mark something every year because we never forget the sacrifice of our people fighting fascism. But I mean, they fought fascism to survive. It's not an ideology that people picked up guns, went out into the streets and decided to take on the night of the SS and the Wehrmacht. Those people fought in the Ukraine and in Russia and actually in the Caucasus and the Crimea. They fought to defend their homes and their lives and their traditions and their culture. Mm-hmm. It's just a lot of people feel that potentially, without scaremongering, that we could slowly be sleepwalking into similar circumstances that led to the Second World War.
We can never sleep, because they certainly never do. Let's take a quick break. A journalist asked me today, out of the blue, apropos nothing, what's your favourite Sex Pistols record? And it was the most difficult question any journalist has ever asked me. I don't have one, but if I was forced to, it would be pretty vacant. So maybe my friends can look for that. Now, as I said at the beginning of the show, all predictions by Project Fear that the British economy would collapse at the very thought of leaving the European Union are being now systematically, quarterly, proved to be bogus. The sky has not fallen down upon us, much to the chagrin of those who predicted that it would. As a matter of fact, for at least the third quarter running, our economic growth is better than the EU, better than Germany, better than France, better than the Eurozone, better than most. And Dr. Gerard Lyons is an expert on these matters. He's an international economist and a strategist at Net Wealth. And he's kindly agreed to join us now. Dr. Lyons, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Pleasure. Good evening.
Just tell us what the numbers are first for this latest quarter. It's the first quarter of this year.
Yes, the latest figures from the Office for National Statistics show the UK economy grew 0.5% in the first 3 months of this year compared to the previous 3 months. So it's a quarterly rate of growth. To put that in perspective, in the last 3 months of last year, the economy grew 0.2%. Now, it has to be said, the 0.5%, which was a pretty solid pace of growth, partly reflects the underlying resilience of the economy, but also those people who are bearish on Brexit that you mentioned in your introduction, they will allude to the fact that there was a big pickup due to stock building. The manufacturing sector grew very strongly in the first 3 months of this year, partly because some firms were doing things in the first 3 months in case things turned bad because of what they feared in terms of a hard Brexit or a no deal. So the economy in the first quarter was very solid. Some of that is the underlying resilience, but there was no doubt also a boost from stockpiling ahead of the end of March. Yes,
but the corollary is that the French, German, Eurozone economies did worse. And what's their excuse?
That's absolutely. I think Project Fear has been misplaced. But what's interesting, even though we're talking about the GDP figures, in my 30 years of following the economy in the City of London, the two economic figures that are never revised and have always given a good snapshot of how the economy has performed have been the tax revenue data and the jobs data. And what we've seen in the last 3 years since the referendum is that both of those figures, the jobs data and the tax revenue data, have both been pretty solid, suggesting the economy is doing quite well. The GDP figures, the gross domestic product figures, are often revised, sometimes revised down, but often revised up. But they're not always the best guide to what's happening. So I think the economy is actually doing pretty well. And even though the GDP figures today were good, I tend to think that we could easily see in future years the figures being revised higher. But there's no doubt that the UK economy is doing far better than the Eurozone. I think there's underlying structural problems in the Euro area, and they're going to persist. But here in the UK, I think a big issue is that we still need to have more of a pro-growth agenda. The balance of the economy still suffers from underlying problems. And in the first 3 months of this year, for instance, we still had another big trade deficit. So lots of things are doing far better than Project Fear, and there are pluses and minuses always when we look at the data in the UK.
Now, the US and Canada are still ahead, but there's a great deal of fear about a crash in the United States, isn't there?
Well, yes, this week has been a particularly bad week for financial markets, and in particular for the equity markets. And that's largely on the back of the potential trade dispute between China and the US. Now, it has to be said that the trade fears picked up in the second half of last year, and it looked like both countries, the US and China, were going to come to a resolution of their dispute. But at the end of the last week, it became clear that the hawks in the Chinese regime had not agreed to everything that had previously been agreed in the 10 rounds of talks. And President Trump has responded in another hawkish way, shall we say. It's like tit for tat. And what the financial markets are currently fearing is that rather than resolving the disputes, both the US and China might decide to sort of stick to their guns. But generally speaking, one would expect to see, after the initial shenanigans, both sides wanting to try and resolve this. But it's important to bear in mind that when you look at a trade dispute, there is a displacement effect in the sense that President Trump has put tariffs on goods coming into the States. Some US consumers will buy cheaper goods from elsewhere. But the big worry for the markets is there's a dampening on economic growth, because higher tariffs are taxes paid by the US consumer. That might hit US consumer spending, might hit exports from China. And if there's a tit-for-tat response from the Chinese, that hits US exports. So coming back to your question, there is a worry about what's going to happen. In the broader sphere, we have to bear in mind that we've now had 10 years since the financial crisis. The UK economy and the US economy have grown far better than many people expected, in the sense that the recovery has been long, but it's been a pretty weak recovery, and it's been heavily benefited, or has benefited heavily, from low interest rates, both in the States and in the UK. So we continue to need low interest rates to keep the economy going, both here and in the States as well.
And of course, there's a cost to low interest rates. There's a cost in saving. Why should people save if they're not getting any interest on it? How long can we maintain these really historic lows in interest rates?
Well, I think interest rates, if we look at the UK perspective, are going to remain low for some time. Inflationary pressures are pretty low. So I think it's a case of rates remaining low, rising gradually, and then maybe peaking at a low level. What's probably going to be more interesting in the UK is what happens to fiscal policy and government spending. Because whichever economy one looks at, George, the outlook depends on the interaction between the fundamentals, policy, and confidence. And the fundamentals are better than people feared in the UK, but still pretty mixed in some respects. Policy, we've received a big boost from interest rates. Now the budget numbers are turning around, and there's a need for more spending on the areas that have underperformed in terms of being squeezed in departmental spending in recent years. And then in addition to the fundamentals policy, confidence is a key factor. And since the referendum in the UK, the jobs data has been good, as I mentioned, but one area that has been weak, partly because confidence has been low, has been investment spending by the private sector. And that's the area we need to see turning around. But coming back to your question about low interest rates, I think we can see a continuation of low rates for some time here in the UK.
And wages are going up, as I predicted, and as incredibly, the Trade Union Congress and almost all of the trade unions were regularly insisting that there was no relationship between the free movement of cheap labour from East and Central Europe to the British labour market. Wages have begun to go up as the prospect of an end to that free movement looms into view.
Yeah, I think there's a whole combination of factors influencing things there, including ones you've just mentioned. But certainly, and coming back to your original question about the GDP figures, one of the positive things in the data today, and I think we're going to see that in the rest of this year, is that consumer spending should be underpinned by the healthy jobs data and also by the fact that wages are now trending higher, and also that inflation is relatively low. So that means real earnings, wages versus inflation, are going to be increasing. So that should help to underpin spending. Of course, there's a bigger issue in the UK as well, that housing costs are still pretty high for those people who are renting, and where people can spend is still constrained in some respects. They're forced to spend on their rents, they're forced to spend on their transport. But coming back to your question, there's absolutely no doubt that wages, and certainly wages relative to inflation, are rising, and that should underpin consumer spending and help the economy grow at a pretty steady pace this year. Remember, last week the Bank of England revised up its forecast for growth this year. Also, the European Commission recently revised up their forecast for UK growth this year. And as you mentioned, we're growing at a faster pace than many of the economies in the euro area.
Hallelujah, I say. Dr. Gerard Lyons, thank you very much indeed for joining us, international economist, strategist at Net Wealth. Now, 0344 499 1000 is the number. As I've said, you can tweet me at George Galloway at Talk Radio. Don't forget to at both of us, because if you don't, they might not come through to me. Email via the website at talkradio.co.uk or text the word talk followed by your message to 87222, though that will cost you 25 pence plus normal sending charges. Now, the much missed, I personally miss him a very great deal, is my old pal from the Canary, Steve Topple, who joins me now. Steve, welcome.
George, thank you so much for having me on Notes. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's lovely to speak to you again.
We miss you. We haven't seen you for some weeks, and there's a good reason for that. And maybe you could start by telling us about that, and then we'll move on to your campaign.
I wasn't expecting to talk about this, but yes, there is a very good reason. My girlfriend, Nicola Jeffrey, is disabled and she's chronically ill. In fact, she's very ill. She's living with 13 different diseases, illnesses and conditions that we've recently discovered, and I've taken a step back from my journalism to support her full-time.
Very, very noble of you, as I'm sure everyone listening is saying, and wishing Nicola all the best and a full recovery. But it's serious, as you say. And one of the things that she has is a kind of ME, isn't it? And there's still a lot of people, I could tell, even in this building, when I said I was going to talk about ME earlier this evening, no names, but I could tell by raised eyebrows that there's still a bit of scepticism about this.
There is, George, yes. It's something that's built up over many years, but trust me, it's a very, very real disease which affects at least 17 million people across the world, and estimates put it at 250,000 people in this country. But of course, these are underestimates probably of the reality of the situation. Now, ME stands for myalgic encephalomyelitis. It's a chronic systemic neuroimmune disease. Symptoms vary for every single person, which is one of the reasons that it's so complex, and one of the reasons why research is quite often difficult into this, because it varies from person to person. But generally, people have flu-like symptoms all the time. They experience all over pain, sleep disturbance, problems with their sleep. They have severe cognitive impairments quite often. The autonomic systems of the body are messed up, such as the nervous system and digestive system. They have hypersensitivity to sound, to light, to taste. But one of the biggest symptoms, and one of the most misunderstood ones, is something called post-exertional malaise. Essentially what this is on any form of exertion, be that physical, mental or emotional, all these symptoms a person has gets 10 times worse. It sometimes happens a few hours after the exertion that they do. It can happen up to 48 hours after the exertion. And worsening of symptoms can sometimes last for days, weeks, or months, and quite often what happens in the severest of cases is people never recover to the point they were at before they did that exertion. So it's an all-over disease which affects every single aspect of a person's body.
And how much more problematic is it that for some of the public, I've no idea what percentage, but for some of the public, there's a skepticism that this is all in the mind?
There is, yes. I mean, the problems with it are numerous. I mean, first off, you have the fact that it is an invisible illness. That is, quite often people don't display any outward signs of it, so you don't always see people saying wheelchairs or with mobility aids. That's the first barrier, and there's a lot of stigma surrounding invisible illnesses generally, but ME falls into that category. So that's the first one. Secondly, the history of ME has been fraught by controversy. I mean, for decades, and quite often now, still in 2019, the medical profession and the arms of the states, like the Department for Work and Pensions, do not properly recognise it. People have been disbelieved, stigmatised, treatments have been incorrect, or invariably told it's all in their heads. And the history of it has played a big part in that. I mean, a lot of your listeners may well have heard of the phrase yuppie flu back in the 1980s. Yes. It was the first when ME was sort of more coming out into the public domain, and it was regarded as yuppie flu, essentially that hard-working, high-stress professionals were effectively having burnout, which we now know, of course, is utter nonsense and not the case at all. But so the stigma and this sort of notion that it's somehow not real has been building and building over decades, and it does still exist, unfortunately.
I remember the first time I came across ME, and I had just been elected to Parliament, so a little over 30 years ago, someone came into my advice surgery and told me that they had ME, and they displayed some of the symptoms and described some of the symptoms you have you yourself have described, and it was the first time I had ever heard of this, which leads me to my next question. Is this a modern thing, or has it always existed? We never gave it a name before.
It's not modern, I don't think it is. I mean, historically, you can trace the first recorded proper outbreak of it because it is a disease, and there's been incidences over history of actual outbreaks. One of the first recorded ones was in Los Angeles in 1934, I believe, which was at the Los Angeles County Hospital, and it was in doctors and nurses all experienced this sudden fatigue, muscle weakness, cramps, severe pain, stiffness, messing up of their autonomic systems. And it stands out in my mind because one of the doctors observing these patients at the time with all these symptoms said it was just like poliomyelitis. Essentially, it was mimicking what polio was, except it wasn't polio. So, and that was 1936. I mean, there's anecdotal evidence of outbreaks and incidences of ME-type illnesses before 1936. They stretch back for several hundred years, but that's the first recorded one. So it isn't new, but the problem is because of various factors, including a lack of research, no one has ever got to the bottom properly of what ME is and how to find it, how to find a biomarker to distinguish it between other illnesses and finally nail the fact that it is a very real disease and therefore then be able to nail the treatment that is needed for it.
Now, what is it you're campaigning for in relation to this?
Oh, George, you know me, I campaign on lots of things, but this week specifically, there's two campaigns going on this week. Firstly, there is the Millions Missing campaign, which is by a patient-led group called ME Action Network. They're a worldwide group, and every year they have a Millions Missing Day, which is always on the 12th of May. This year they've extended it to cover the whole week from last Sunday to this Sunday. Essentially, the notion of millions missing is that there are millions of people living with ME who are missing from their lives because of the severity of the illness and how debilitating it is. They are unable to work, they are unable to interact socially, they are missing from family, friends, everything we as healthy individuals would take for granted. And of course, it's also missing in terms of the research funding for it and missing from recognition from the medical profession. So that's why it's Millions Missing. It's a global campaign. There's various actions that have gone on throughout the week, but Sunday the 12th of May is the main focus day where there'll be protests and demonstrations across the world, and people attempting to raise more awareness and calling for money to be invested into research. Briefly, the second campaign is called ME Awareness Week. That's by the UK-based charity ME Association, one of the few charities which I actually rate, who I think are very good at what they do. And again, it's raising awareness throughout the course of the week. They have a very good campaign called Go Blue for ME, where people are sharing pictures on social media of them wearing something blue, holding something blue, and that acts as a crowdfunding campaign for them to continue their work on what they're doing. So these are going on a week. As I say, the kind of centre point is this Sunday, the 12th of May, and you can get involved using the hashtags Millions Missing, ME Awareness Week, and also MAIMS, which is MAIMES.
Well, they're very lucky to have a redoubtable campaigner like you on their side, I must say. No one could have squeezed into 9 minutes the amount of information you just have. So I wish you and them all the best, Steve, and to Nicola, of course, our love. And don't be a stranger. Stay in touch, even if you are just on the phone from home, please.
Please send our love to Goucher as well. And that was a lovely tweet you put out the other day about making her laugh. So.
Yeah, it's not a bad picture. It's going well on... it's good to be able to make your wife laugh. No doubt about that.
Exactly so. George, thank you for having me on.
God bless you. And Nicola, thanks very much. Steve Topple of the Canary. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. A lot of people are getting in touch about the ME issue that Steve Topple so peerlessly raised in the last quarter of the show, the last quarter of an hour, of this particular show. So if you have something you want to say about that, call us 0344 499 1000 or tweet at Talk Radio at George Galloway or email through the website at talkradio.co.uk. Now, Samson in Kilmarnock, you'll recall, is our Southwest Scotland professor. He's in charge of our faculty in Ayrshire, one of the cleverest men in the country. He says, one of the more abstruse or perhaps concealed truths of World War II relates to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. Establishment figures love nothing more than to pass the pact off as an alliance between the Nazis and the Soviets. The reality is rather different. It was instead a treaty of non-aggression. More importantly, the Soviets pursued the treaty only after exhausting repeated overtures to establish an alliance with the British and French governments. When it was clear the latter were stalling and hoping to turn Hitler eastwards, the Soviets had little choice but to buy time to further industrialize their country for war. Perhaps we aren't taught this in school for the same reasons the media ignored May the 9th. Propagandists enjoy presenting a false equivalence between the Soviets and the Nazis, and this is exposed when the true history is told. Indeed so, Samson, and if you want to read my article on that very subject, you can go to rt.com. In the op-eds, you'll find what I had to say about that. Now, as I said in the last hour, we're going to do Ask Adam. We normally do it at the end of the month, but I won't be here, I should tell you now, on the 24th of May, because I shall be in Moscow. I've got to get my orders for the year from President Putin in the Kremlin. Only joking, Mr. Ofcom. Let's hear from the head of our Highland faculty, the professor that is Donald in Inverness. Go ahead, Donald.
Good evening, George.
Good evening.
One quick point on your ME saying you have some thoughts. As a medical doctor, I want to confirm the existence of ME to the skeptics that are out there. Dr. Darrell Ho Yen was a top author on the subject, and he was a friend and colleague of mine in our local hospital, and he was a consultant microbiologist who actually worked with my father in the top infectious diseases hospital in Scotland. So I'll leave others to... Is
it a disease, therefore, that you can catch, Donald?
I don't think so. What they think is it's got various names. One is post-viral fatigue syndrome, and your previous Steve Topple was talking there about the fatigue that people get. It's possibly, we don't know what's causing it, but it's very likely an overhang from some viral disease that people get, and it may be an abnormal response to catching some viral infection, which we've still got to find out, and it could be an...
If it's affecting 250,000 people, I mean, that is a lot of people, especially if, as Steve thinks, it's an underestimate. You'd think there would be a bit more effort going into identifying the cause.
Well, George, there are countless numbers of viruses. And viruses in the old days, people looked upon them as bad things because, of course, they affect us. But as you're probably aware, that viruses are now being used by the medical profession for a good purpose. That is, just as antibiotics would hit a foreign attacker in the system, viruses can now go in and start snipping out bits of abnormal DNA and are going to help us curing cancer.
Wow.
So, viruses and the thousands and millions of unknown viruses out there are still to be identified. I mean, there's many diseases that are probably infectious by the time we're finished, but we just haven't found the infective agent.
Very interesting. Anyway, go on, Donald, with the subject you called up about.
Yeah, just one quick one on Rudolf Hess. My same father that I was talking about, he was in Ayrshire when Rudolf Hess landed in Eaglesham, so it'll be interesting to hear what you have to say about that when it comes.
Yes.
So my subject, George, was when you're talking about yellow vests and the fascist violence in Ukraine, and I want to broaden that a wee bit to ask your thoughts on this about, you've had large marches going through London for and against Brexit, and there's a long, long history of the right of public protest. And on the other hand, you've got, on the other hand, reading the Riot Act. Now, I feel that the right of peaceful protest is being abused and is being replaced by the right to silence people and intimidate bystanders. And I'm moving in the direction that it's time to call a halt to this megaphone diplomacy and intimidation in public protests. Now, you and I are against violence in the streets, and we like intelligent debate, but megaphone diplomacy is not helpful. So my question, there are 3 areas I'd like you to kind of just try and quickly address if you can. Number one, what are the aims and limitations upon marching? Has the time passed, and if not, why not? Because megaphone diplomacy is for those who can shout loudest. That's the first point. The second point is the privilege of those who live near Westminster and Holyrood, who can get a few banners and go and shout and bawl with a microphone, and the media will come rushing to them and give them all sorts of publicity. And the rest of us in other parts of the country don't have that privilege. So if you can shout loud, you'll get yourself onto the television with your views. And that's one of the great advantages of the mother of all talk shows, is we can phone in and get our thoughts. Now, that's the second, is the privilege or the abuse of privilege, or whatever you want. The third thing is on the peaceful aspects of it, that many public marches are not contributing to public debate, but they simply promote the idea that shouting loud will win the argument. And loudmouths are not debaters. And many demonstrations are simply loudmouths with loudhailers. And if they can't argue their case calmly, then why should they be allowed to do it at the top of their voices at public expense? So
well, it's a fascinating raft of questions that would do justice, actually, for a program of its own. The first thing I'd need to say is that, and I've said it before in relation to wiping people off social media, that if you stopped protests, very soon the demand would move on to stopping other forms of dissent and disagreement with the prevailing orthodoxy. So I could never be in favour of stopping protests, stopping marches. That doesn't mean that every march, every demonstration, every protest should be supported, or that I support it. I don't. Because something has the form of progressiveness, it doesn't mean it has the content of progressiveness. It's the biggest demonstration that I had to fight my way through into Parliament was the Hunt people. Do you remember them? Back in, I can't remember now, it was in Blair's time, in the early part of this century, I think, when 400,000 of these people who love the idea of ripping live animals apart for pleasure and for entertainment, for sport, were gathered outside Parliament. And I remember how unpleasant it was. It had the form of a protest and demonstration, like many hundreds, maybe thousands on which I myself have marched, but its content was to me deeply repugnant. But we can't say that people who support fox hunting or other things of which we disapprove should forfeit the right to protest. I know you're not saying that per se, but I just want to chalk that up on the wall as my position. It doesn't mean that we should pay attention to every protest. Some protests are best ignored. You know my view on the expensive waft of perfume that went through the streets of London with the chiffon scarves and the soft shoe shufflers of the anti-Brexit Waitrose Brigade. I think those protests are best ignored, and I certainly did my best to ignore, indeed to lampoon them. The right to protest, of course, stops exactly at the point where it actually impinges upon the rights of the rest of us. So a violent demonstration, for example, is intolerable in a democratic society. People who set out with, masks on their face, carrying things that can be used as weapons and so on, absolutely not in a democratic country. If there's no democracy, of course, that will become inevitable. But in a democratic country with a right to vote, and I'll come back to that point, a right to vote and the right for their vote to count, to be counted fairly and to be implemented if you are successful, these all trump, if you'll forgive the pun, these all negate the right to violent protest. I'm wholly against that. Neither do I concede an unlimited right of people to march and protest. If their purpose is to break the law, to incite racial and religious hatred, for example, from my point of view, they have no right to protest. So I gave the example on here long time ago on the issue of, and the Americans have a different view to this, and the ACLU, the Civil Liberties Union in America, supports the right of the American Nazi Party to march in their uniforms through Jewish areas in New York. To me, this is a monstrosity, and I would never support the right of those who wished to dance on other people's graves, to desecrate their religious beliefs and their holy days. I would never support the right of British fascists, who are small in number, but who exist, to march through, I don't know, Golders Green or another recognizably heavily Jewish populated area. I would never support that. So these are some of the caveats that I would enter to my otherwise wholehearted support, Donald, of people's right to protest.
Thanks. I mean, you see more of these things, and you've participated more of them than we have in Inverness. We're not used to marching, but now I'm sorry to say that the homosexual lobby is introducing an annual marching season here, and I'm uncomfortable that we're not used to these things. And it's more like...
I think there have always been gay people in the Highlands, Donald.
Yes, but it's more a sort of triumphal... I mean, my feeling is that it's a triumphalist and could turn intimidatory attitude from what I hear happens in places in pride marches in London. But these are reports that I hear. But maybe the point
I've never come across that, and I wouldn't be intimidated by anyone on a gay pride march, and I don't think you Highlanders will either. I mean, you're running around in your kilts and tossing your cabers.
Well, you mentioned Trump there, so just one last thought. Judd Trump and trumping Donald Trump.
Yes.
He's done quite well. I was very pleased. All those years ago when he just missed out in the final to John Higgins, I'm talking about the snooker, for those people who don't know. I wrote
people who haven't misspent their youth like thee and me.
Oh, I won't ask you about the football because I know how you'll feel about all that.
Yes.
But anyway, we'll leave it at that, George.
Well, it's been fascinating as always talking to you, Donald, the professor in Inverness, the head of our Highland faculty. Controversial views there from the Highlands about the gay pride marches. I'm all for them myself, and I think that someone celebrating their way of life can never be a bad thing, really. That would be my view. 0344 499 1000. Sam is on the line in New York. Sam, welcome.
Hey, George.
Hi there.
First, I'm going to ask you a question. Just when are you going to do another chat with Jimmy Dore? We all love that.
Yeah, it was good. We must try and get him back on the show. Definitely. Yeah, I'm a big fan of his now.
Yeah,
and Lee Camp. Have you followed the work of Lee Camp?
Oh, I loved it. Have you seen his most recent interview with Max Blumenthal?
Yeah, he and Max together is pure gold. Max is one of my heroes in the world. He's one of the finest men, and I had dinner with him quite recently in a pizza restaurant in London with his partner Anya Parampil, with whom I used to work on American television. And to have Max and Lee in a conversation, it's absolutely pure gold.
I couldn't agree. I mean, you had London pizza, which I don't know if you can call pizza, but it's all right. We'll let it slide.
Well, we could have an argument about that. I'm not actually a pizza man myself. I avoid carbs if I can. But they were, and they're New Yorkers. They were well satisfied. Pizza East was the place, but other pizzas are available.
Yeah, I'm sure. I wouldn't be a New Yorker if I didn't always rip on every other pizza.
Yeah. Anyway, go on.
Well, no, I'm glad you actually we were chatting on Max because his newest book, Management of Savagery.
Yeah.
When you go through it, I was not even remotely surprised when I was listening to your show, and they're saying how Le Pen is closing in on Macron.
Yeah, or overtaking him in some polls.
Right, because I think what's happening now in France is what happened in the U.S. about 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Which is you had, and the media literally called Macron like the Obama of France.
Yeah.
Well, the problem is he is the neoliberal of France.
Yeah.
And people are tired of it. I mean, I'm sure in France where their healthcare is 100 times better than ours. But when you have Macron coming in and putting more neoliberal policies, there was doubt in my mind this was going to happen. I mean, where you could see the similarities, where the U.S. had problems with the trade deals like NAFTA and TPP and et cetera. Well, France has the problems with the EU deals that probably cost the same types of jobs.
Yeah.
When Macron, when they ran the first time, I remember thinking to myself, I said, if they're not careful, Le Pen could do this. And I remember telling, I was chatting, I don't know if you watch Secular Talk.
No.
It's another show with similar like Jimmy Dore.
Okay.
I would recommend. But
okay.
Anyway, the point I was making was I was chatting with the guy and I said, Le Pen's like, in a way, the Trump of France, but
Yes.
she's more elegant. And what I meant by that was
everybody's more elegant than Trump.
Oh, sure. You can get the crazy lunatic on the F train who's more elegant than Trump, and he talks to a shoe half the time. So, but my point is, she puts the framing of immigration in a different manner. So Trump will say just pure bigotry and nonsense. What she does is she puts it in the context of, well, let's first examine why we have mass refugees. And I remember when she did this interview, I was saying to myself, oh, she's figured out something here that's probably going to hit on a lot of people. Whereas Trump was a faux populist, a fake populist who was talking about the trade deals and being anti-war, Le Pen puts it in the context of, well, like, look, we get the refugees because I was proud when our government stood against the U.S. in Iraq, but then we get all the refugees. Then I think it was Hollande when he contributes in bombing Libya. She's like, America doesn't deal with the refugees.
No, it was Sarkozy.
Sarkozy. And she said, now when we're having in Syria, the same problem is, why is it our job to do this? I mean, we wouldn't have the problem of the refugee crisis if we weren't contributing to these wars. And I remember thinking that's going to strike a chord. And I knew that she would more likely catch up was about last September when the U.S. launched missiles into Syria. It was the U.S., France, and England over that supposed chemical attack in Douma.
Yeah.
And I remember Le Pen leading the protest, screaming like this is going to cause more refugees and so on and so. And I said, oh, yeah, she's definitely going to...
She's on to something, yeah. Well, look, Sam, you're so bang on the money. There's not a lot of point in me pretending to argue with you. I just make this point. I've got a Syrian standing just a few yards from me now, but there's glass between us. So if he doesn't like what I'm about to say, he can't really do much about it. Oh, he's telling me he can close my mic. Here's my point. I've known a lot of Syrians. I've been married to one. Syrians are of all the peoples of the Arab world, your Syrian is the least likely to want to be a refugee. The Syrians have the highest opinion of themselves, and much of it is entirely justified. Syria is a highly cultured, prosperous, Levantine people. And the idea that they wanted to walk through Turkey, through Hungary, into the European Union to wash up as a refugee in Middlesbrough is completely absurd. We caused the flow of millions of Syrian refugees. We caused it, not just by our bombing and our missiles and our special forces, but by our propagandizing for, our financing, our arming, and our political support for the most savage, fanatic, Islamist extremism ever seen anywhere in the world, virtually none of whom, in the end, were Syrian. In Idlib, right now, there's been a huge battle, and the captured Takfiri terrorists are almost all Uyghur Chinese. They're from Chechnya. They're from Tunisia, from Algeria, from Saudi Arabia, from England, from France, from Holland, from Belgium. They don't even speak Arabic. Never mind the highly refined dialect of the Syrian people. So, no one who supported those wars has any right at all to complain about the wave of refugees that they ineluctably produced. We did the same in Iraq. We did the same in Afghanistan. We did the same in Libya. We did the same in Syria. Now the US is preparing to do the same in Iran. And the same people supporting these wars are going to be the people complaining about the human flow of desperate people that will come in the opposite direction. Last word to you, Sam.
Well, everything you said was spot on. 'Cause I'm actually of Syrian descent. I'm half Syrian, half Lebanese.
Well, there you go.
But yeah, well, I'm just
sorry
saying,
if I painted you as a snob, but most of the Syrians I've known are quite high-nosed, shall I say. They have a high opinion, of themselves, and it's usually justified.
No, you were spot on. Trust me, it's like you're describing half my family. No, I can agree with you more. And I was just going to make this last point: is when you're talking about this, when we're talking about the war of Iran, and I just want to say that you're going to see this probably, and also if Le Pen starts winning, it's going to start seeing Russia meddling, the same nonsense we went through. But I would want to just finish the point of everything you said was correct on Idlib. You have groups like the Turkestanic Islamic Party, Ahrar al-Sham. Al-Qaeda or HTS or whatever alphabet soup they go by. But when you look at the media, what are the words you read on the headline? Last rebel stronghold.
Rebel, yeah. Yeah. Throat cutting, head chopping, priest killing, church destroying. They're called rebels in the Western media. Whereas if they were running across London Bridge, they'd be quite rightly being shot down and described as mad dogs.
And you could watch articles, or watch videos or read articles. They'll admit the largest group is the Al-Qaeda force, HTS. They're the jihadist force. I'm thinking to myself, well, you're admitting they're jihadists, you're admitting they're Al-Qaeda linked, but yet the whole thing is on the notion of rebels. But I just pray, George, that we won't have another chemical attack thing happening, because I get that.
No, I think they've given up in Syria now, Sam, and they've also given up in Venezuela after the fiasco. Iran is in the crosshairs now.
Well, that was just funny to watch on the U.S. side of the flailing regime change narrative.
Well, as Oscar Wilde said on describing the death scene in Charles Dickens' Little Nell, you'd have to have a heart of stone not to laugh at John Bolton and co. Elliot Abrams et al. Sam in New York, thanks for a fascinating call. Scouser Larsky, my old pal up in Liverpool, says America have been involved in attacking countless countries since the end of World War II, and Iran have attacked absolutely none. Yet America wants the world to think that Iran is a threat. 0344 499 1000. Now, as I said, exactly 70 years ago, one of the most bizarre episodes in the Second World War unfolded. The deputy to Adolf Hitler got in a plane alone, flew 1,000 miles, then parachuted into Ayrshire and ended up, Adam, I'm sure, will tell us, with the Duke of Hamilton. Now, nobody ever explained, least of all him, why he did that. Who knew he was going to do it? Whether he was authorized to do it? Whether it was some kind of plan to talk Britain out of the war in preparation for the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, that was very soon to succeed it, to begin. So Adam Gary is not just the cleverest man in England. He's not just the star of our Ask Adam hours here on the Mother of All talk shows. He's got a day job, and he is the director at the think tank Eurasia Future. Eurasia Future. Adam, welcome.
Lovely
Slightly earlier
back.
than the month than we expected, but as I say, I've been summoned to Moscow by Comrade Putin.
Who's going to win the election then?
To find out what the results of the next British and European and American elections are.
And for legal reasons, that's of course a joke.
I'm basically going to be told who's going to be the next president of the United States and who's going to be the next Prime Minister of Britain. Welcome.
Lovely to be back.
Hess is a great mystery. Tell us what happened.
He's a great mystery, and he's one of these very interesting fellows, and he was even interesting in an objective sense long before the 10th of May 1941. Some people will attest that Hess was the brains, if you can call it that, behind the Hitler program, the Hitler manifesto that was the book Mein Kampf, which was released in the 1920s. Hitler, of course, wrote it in prison, but Hess was one of the book's editors, and Hess was mentored by a man who many credit with creating the fundamentals of the Nazi ideology, and this was Herr Haushofer. Now, he always kept a bit of an arm's length to the Nazi leadership, but he spoke with them, he knew them, they knew him, he lived perfectly happily, to put it mildly, during the Hitler Reich period. But Hess was a political man, and he was almost subservient in his loyalty to Hitler. Many people think that Mein Kampf was actually rewritten in significant parts by him. And he was also a star of the stage and screen, if one can put it that way, but when propaganda is politics and politics is propaganda, I suppose you can. In the 1935 film Triumph of the Will, directed by Leni Riefenstahl, famous or infamous, depending on one's point of view. He's seen as kind of the warm-up act before Hitler. So, I mean, it's not really, how's everyone doing tonight in Nuremberg? It's obviously a lot more grim than that. But he was the one announcing Hitler and building up all the tension, courting the cheers from the audience. But when the war began, his duties became reduced. He still had a very important title, but his active role wasn't as important because you can't really have a mass rally during the war. The troops aren't parading, they're going to fight. So the other side of his life was that he was an amateur pilot enthusiast. He loved flying planes, and for a while, when the war with Britain began in 1939, Hitler specifically prohibited him from flying about. He threw a strop, and the ban was eventually lifted. He then started training quite seriously for what in those days was a long-distance flight, because he had gotten wind by the spring of 1941 that the deal, the credit supply and the non-aggression pact that was guaranteed between the Soviet Union and the Hitler Reich, it was going to be broken, and it was going to be broken by the German side. So he got the idea, and most people, including Churchill, mind you, agree that it was totally his idea. He confided in Haushofer, but he didn't confide in anyone else, that he had the plan to fly solo in a Messerschmitt Bf-110 bomber to Scotland to meet with a man called the Duke of Hamilton, or to call him by his Christian name, Douglas Hamilton, no relation to Boutros Ghali. Now, why did he choose Hamilton? That's possibly the weirdest aspect of a very weird story. Now, like like Hess, Hamilton was an amateur pilot enthusiast, and he later joined the RAF and had a very respectable role in the RAF. The two of them were probably at some of the same functions when the Duke of Hamilton was at the Berlin Olympics in 1936. Hamilton, though, had no recollection of meeting him, if indeed they were in the same room, which they probably were. Maybe it was a forgettable how do you do. For Hamilton, obviously, Hess didn't forget. So on this date in 1941, flying simply from memory, looking at the sites that he had trained himself to look at, he flew solo successfully to Scotland. He crash-landed his plane, parachuted out, was a bit injured, and was fairly rapidly apprehended by the authorities. He gave them a false name, but by the time he was presented with the Duke of Hamilton, who called on him in prison, he told him of his real name and of his real intentions. He came with the idea that, knowing that Hitler was going to make the ultimately suicidal decision to invade the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, that it was strategic suicide for a country like Germany to fight a war on two fronts. He wanted Britain to make an accord with Germany that says, so long as Germany guarantees the safety of the British Empire, which was very substantial at that period in time, then Germany will essentially have a hands-off approach to Britain, and Germany will get free rein within Europe, which they more or less already had, but importantly, they would have free rein to attack the Soviet Union. Now, Hitler was absolutely furious. Goebbels was absolutely furious. Everyone in the top Nazi command was totally furious. He was denounced publicly as a madman by the German authorities, and because of that, the British then announced the story. And from there on out, he spent the rest of his life in prison. He was in Britain throughout the war, then he was transferred to the Nuremberg trials, and he spent his last decades in the infamous Spandau prison, where he eventually...
He was the only prisoner.
Towards the end. So the conditions got better because you had this substantial, monolithic prison, but for around, I think, 10 years or so, he was the only one there. And after several suicide attempts, he finally got lucky in the late 80s, if you want to put it that way, and that was the end of the very long and peculiar Rudolf Hess story.
Well, there's many questions that arise from that. Unfortunately, we need to take a break, but we will continue after the break. That's Adam Gary, director of the think tank Eurasia Future, who is, as I've said, the cleverest man in England. Now, before we go on to the Ask Adam segment, I just want to quiz you a little bit on the Hess story. You taught me something I didn't know, that he had been one of the editors of Mein Kampf. And you said in the break, some suspect, not just an editor, but a very creative editor. Indeed. Who, in a sense, maybe even ghost wrote this Bible of fascism that Mein Kampf became. And therefore I'm wondering how plausible that a man who was a bootlicker of Adolf Hitler, who was with him since the putsch in the beer hall in Munich, who edited his Bible, who was the second, officially, I take your point, the war meant he was less important on a day-to-day basis, but he remained the second man in the state, that he would undertake such a mission in the middle of the war without Hitler's knowledge is quite difficult for me to believe.
And I think the answer to this lies in Hess's personality. He was a real maverick, some would say an oddball. He was into all sorts of the occult, into faith healing, into all, let's say, heterodox personal practices. Like Hitler was at times, he was a vegetarian, but he took it much more seriously. And beyond that, he refused to eat food that wasn't prepared in front of him. And this made Hitler, at one point, just disinvite him to dinners, because as everyone was turning up in their Hugo Boss designed Nazi uniforms, another interesting fact for the fashionistas out there, but he would turn up with, a vegetable god and proverbially a cornucopia of vegetables and whatnot under his shoulders. And Hitler found that annoying, which is one of the rare instances where I think a lot of dinner hosts might actually agree with the dictator himself. So he was something of a one-off. And he was sort of a man on a mission in his own mind. And he thought that he had crafted this very unique plot to essentially save the Reich. And I honestly think in his heart of hearts, he thought that he would be a hero, not only in the Reich, but also in Britain. He thought that he was essentially saving the world. He had one of these savior complexes, which is one of those most dangerous characteristics in individuals, both in history and
Tony
in one's
Blair
personal
had one
life.
of those.
Yes.
The second thing I find difficult to swallow is A, that the Duke of Hamilton had never met him, because in 1936, at the time of the Olympics, the Nazis were in power, the war hadn't started, Hess was the second man in the Nazi state. If the Duke of Hamilton had met him, he would remember it. And whilst I actually know the son very well, the son of the Duke of Hamilton, I served with him in Parliament for a very long time. I liked him very much. Lord James Douglas Hamilton, who became the heir to the dukedom. I've spoken to about the Hess thing. He maintains that his father was an anti-fascist, an anti-Nazi, and he did have a distinguished war record, as you say. But the Scottish aristocracy were heavily seeded with pro-Nazi individuals. If you look at the names of the Anglo-German Fellowship and the myriad of fifth columnists that existed in Britain, Tim Tate has a wonderful book on it that I recommend to everyone. Indeed, I've interviewed him on this show about it. For every English aristocrat, you'll find proportionately, Scotland to England proportionally, 10 times more people in England than in Scotland, you'll find a huge number of Scottish aristocrats were actually fellow travellers of Hitler. So, in my view, Hess chose wisely, actually, in flying to a landed estate belonging to a Scottish aristocrat. What did the then Duke of Hamilton say? Was he not embarrassed that this man had flown to see him?
Well, he hid his embarrassment quite well, and I think he and the authorities, if there was private embarrassment, they would have had to have hid it, because unless he was a traitor, in which circumstance you would get the jail cell or even the gallows, and he clearly wasn't that. What are you going to do? You can't say that you're embarrassed that, oh, whoops, I'm not a Nazi, but Nazis just happen to really like me.
They just drop in by parachute.
In the middle of the war.
Yeah.
So they had to sort of hush it up. And there was actually, in Parliament, there was a statement written because naturally people at the time were asking exactly what you're asking now. And so the Wartime Coalition was very firm about saying that he's been a very honourable, a very dutiful, a very patriotic, noble lord. And that was more or less the end of it, even though in the same way that if Google existed at that time, there would have been the Duke of Hamilton right under the JFK assassination of 9/11, neither of which had happened yet. But I think you get the drift when it comes to, will we ever truly know what everyone thought and everyone said behind closed doors in an age where not everything was recorded, covertly or overtly, the way it is now? I don't think we'll ever fully know what truly was in the heads of which people. But suffice it to say, I do think in terms of Hess, not only did he have this savior complex, especially by the 1940s, but I think that he almost thought of Hamilton as a kind of celebrity. He was the first man, the first aviator to actually fly over Everest. And because of that, he was quite well known in the circle of flying men and their comparatively primitive machines in those days. So there may have been something that. And one of the things in terms of these weird historical events and how to analyze them, when logic doesn't reach the conclusion that it should, look at the personalities, look at the irrational things that might be going on. I think that if Hess was starstruck by Hitler, he may have also been starstruck by Hamilton, even if Hamilton was being honest in not remembering the meeting that they probably did briefly have, the encounter they briefly had in 1936.
The other aspect of the mystery, Berlin, Spandau, was controlled by Britain, the United States, France, and the Soviet Union. They each had guards in Spandau. They all four of them had guards. They had controlling rights on the prison. Over the decades, the Americans, the British, and the French all wanted Hess to be released. He was kept until his death only because of the insistence of the Soviet Union that he must continue his all life sentence. Now, some said that was because it gave the Soviet Union rights in West Berlin, where the prison was, gave them the ability to travel into West Berlin, and they had a foothold in a way, and that might be true. But the Soviet Union never forgave Hess, but the other parties did. And that made me also, as I'm talking about 30 years ago, 40 years ago even, when I used to look at this story and the regular pleas by doctors and by government ministers in the other allied governments that he should be let go, that made me a bit suspicious.
Well, is this the first time that the Western powers have wanted other countries to let their prisoners out of prison? Just read the newspaper today. Every terrorist, miscreant and troublemaker in countries that the United States, Britain and France don't like, there's pleas for clemency and for human rights. So there's quite a bit of that going on, because obviously the Soviets didn't forgive what the Germans did. And why should they? Because the Soviets suffered disproportionately. 65% of all the deaths in that war were there. So I think one part is emotional and the other part is geostrategic. The Soviet Union had no geostrategic reason to let him go, where in terms of the West, it sort of fit into their narrative, both then and now.
Now, your vegan coach tweets, no, not true. Hitler was once put on a veggie fast by his doctor to combat his excessive wind and sweating. Also, Goebbels put out propaganda that Hitler was veggie to make him seem ascetic to the public. That's where the Hitler was veggie thing comes from. So your vegan coach is bristling at the idea that Hitler really was a vegetarian. What's Ask Adam's answer to that?
Well, the people that claim to know him well, and I'm talking about people who weren't high up in the Nazi circles, people like waitresses, women in high society, people that sort of saw the private Hitler that the wider world wasn't supposed to see. They said that he was, they've got lapsed Catholics, that he was sort of a lapsed vegetarian. So I agree with the statement that he wasn't a very good vegetarian, and the propaganda did play up this asceticism of it, but he did give it a go.
But he had excessive wind and sweating, and he only had one ball. So, at least that's what my grandfather used to sing.
I think we know where the other is.
Now, Mummy Girl, Bev Steen, says, didn't Adolf Hitler's nephew marry an Irish woman, and they lived in Liverpool for some time before moving to America? And didn't they have 4 children, all therefore great-nephews of Hitler, who themselves had no children?
Are you sure she doesn't mean Argentina? It's a long way from Liverpool.
Well, Liverpool before moving to America, you can't shed any light on that.
I'm afraid that in my documents,
the
that's still classified.
no children thing leans to the one ball idea. Melanie Baines says, that we're on to ME. So let me do one more Ask Adam here. Here's one for Ask Adam. Several weeks ago, Adam identified himself as a libertarian. Can he explain to listeners what the libertarian political ideology is, its social economic makeup, and why does he choose to identify as such?
Well, I don't, and that's the problem with taking words too literally. What I did say is that I'm becoming more and more libertarian the older I get. And the reason for this is because all men are fallible. And the more one witnesses history unfold, the more one sees the danger of this fallibility if it's elevated to the level of perfection. If we go back to the divine right of kings with modern clothes and modern apparatus, we get to a state where we say, I'm moral and virtuous and I will tell you what to do. Well, that's great if you believe in the morals and virtues of the person telling you what to do, but tomorrow it's going to be someone else and you probably won't like them. This is an argument for democracy. It's an argument for free speech. And when one extrapolates that into what libertarian is, and I'll get into that in a moment, it makes a strong argument for what I call ethical libertarianism. I'm not a pure libertarian. I'm not a pure anything. I think you've got to take the best aspects of all systems, and I'm totally anti-ideological, but you take the best aspects from all systems, and in terms of free speech and democracy and the kind of control over society, it's distinct from the economy and social services, so all you Corbyn supporters don't panic. But when it comes to how society is governed in terms of how humans interact with themselves and with the authorities that have the ability to shut them down, I'm absolutely becoming more of a libertarian. And there were quite a lot of people who associated themselves with that moniker. Most interestingly, possibly because it's the least expected, would be none other than Michael Foot, who called himself a libertarian socialist for much of his life.
Melanie, this is not really for you, Adam, but it's important. Yes. Melanie Baines says, my daughter was struck down with ME for 3 years whilst at high school. The treatment that she and I, as her mother, received from the paediatrician and head teacher was nothing short of atrocious. I had to arrange for a solicitor to attend a meeting. That's quite a common theme, Melanie, that I'm picking up here. Generation X says, I have ME, George. I have had multiple transplants, but nothing compares to ME. Its effects are so fierce, there are times when I am too weak to get out of bed, or eat, or even drink a glass of water. It really is an illness, and not a made-up thing. Ryan says, just like on Victory Day, when the USSR crushed the plague of Nazism, it is my belief that Russia is once again fighting modern fascism, from jihadi proxies in Syria to legitimate neo-Nazi battalions in Ukraine. Putin is Europe's towering leader. I'll tell him you said that, Ryan. Scouser Larsky says, given Trump's policies towards Iran, Adam, are we on the verge of seeing war between the United States and Iran?
I mean, you can never predict anything with Donald Trump except the fact that he's unpredictable. But I don't actually think we're going to see a hot war with Iran. I think we're going to see several other things. I think the US is going to perversely attempt to stabilize the perpetually failed state, or failed entity you could even call it, in Afghanistan, in order to try to organize some calculated provocations against Iran's softest border, which is its Afghan border, which is equally porous with Pakistan's border. So in other words, if one pictures a map, you'll have provocateurs, terrorists going from southwestern Afghanistan into the southwestern Pakistani province of Baluchistan, into the southeastern Iranian province of Sistan and Baluchistan. I think that the US will also try to weaponize this figure who was quite well known in 2003, 2004, Muqtada al-Sadr. The Saudis already made a deal with him, in spite of the fact he's a Shia cleric, but he is one with historical differences with Khomeini and that strata of Shia Islamic political thought. So the Saudis and the Americans are turning the screws on the top dog in southern Iraq. They're trying to bring violent order to what is now violent chaos in Afghanistan and southwestern Pakistan. And I think it will be these little provocations that will try to disrupt the peace and political stability in Iran, but we're not going to see shock and awe. We could, but I really don't think so.
Why is he moving these naval assets and bombers into... There's B-34s, are they now? The very heavy bombers have just landed in Qatar, where the world's biggest U.S. military base is. The aircraft carriers are headed, if they're not already there, to the Persian Gulf. Is this just saber rattling?
Well, something very similar happened throughout 2017 when Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump were at each other's throats rhetorically for the better part of the year. And towards the end of that year, especially around the time of Trump's infamous Rocket Man speech at the United Nations, the most undiplomatic thing since Khrushchev allegedly pounded his shoe on the table.
Well, it wasn't allegedly, I saw it.
Very good. Maybe you'll get to see the shoe in the museum in a few weeks. But I think that it's a storm and fury signifying a dangerous provocation, but I don't think we're going to see shock and awe. Even John Bolton isn't that stupid.
John Bolton and Mike Pompeo were both in the CIA this afternoon because I was on American television earlier this evening, as I am every evening, and the reports were breaking that Bolton, Pompeo, was in the CIA building, and that this hadn't happened. The National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, and the Director of the CIA had never had a meeting inside the CIA with presumably important CIA officers since the days prior to the invasion of Iraq.
Which is very ominous indeed, but I just don't see it happening. And I'd be willing to put money on it. Now, literally, I don't think it's ethical to put money on war and peace. It's not football and it's not an election, but I just don't see it happening. I hope it doesn't happen. This is one of the few instances that I hope I'm right in terms of a prediction, but anything can happen. I just think that it's going to be provocation and violence by 1,000 cuts, because they wouldn't dare do shock and awe against Iran for a lot of the reasons that you spoke of earlier about how it's much bigger, much more powerful, much more disciplined even than Iraq was in the early 2000s.
Let's take a break for some capitalist messages. Scouser Larsky, a man I trust or I wouldn't be reading this out, says it's true that William Patrick Hitler, the nephew of Adolf Hitler, lived in Liverpool. He moved to America before the war. His flat on Upper Stanhope Street was ironically bombed in a Luftwaffe raid on Liverpool. That is absolutely amazing. This truly is the Open University of the airwaves. Ryan says the most chilling moment of the week has to be Mike Pompeo whipping up jingoistic Cold War rhetoric as he stated the Iron Lady would never have given China access to the UK 5G networks. These hawks are determined to drag us to the apocalypse. Adam, I've been wondering, Gavin Williamson's gone quiet, so I'm beginning to edit my previous view that he may in fact have been set up in the Huawei thing, because someone I trust, Craig Murray, the Honourable Craig Murray, he says that there's actuality of the telephone conversation between Williamson and the Telegraph journalist. We can't confirm that, of course, but it would explain, if it were true, why Gavin's not so loudly demanding that the police be brought in to clear his name.
He was, though, photographed, selfied with George Osborne.
George Osborne, and some people were asking for captions. I thought there were some good ones. But I've been wondering why, when the Americans don't like it, the Australians, the New Zealanders don't like it, presumably Israel, which isn't in the Five Eyes, but might as well be, is unlikely to like it. Why has a section, at least, of the British Tory government decided to cut Huawei some slack on this?
Because I think there's a small faction, but it's a fairly competent faction, which isn't saying much, the competition isn't great, that understands that without China, you're going to have to wait a long time to get 5G. And people aren't going to like that. These people who think that Britain's empire is still there, certainly when they're in the private members' clubs, they don't want to be faced with the statistics, even in such a place as the Daily Telegraph that says Britain is so far behind all these other developed economies because they said no to Huawei. There's only two games in town right now when it comes to 5G. There's China and there's the United States. And in this area, China is ahead. No one can deny it. Donald Trump is really upset about it, which is another point of proof about just how far China is ahead on this thing. So I think there's a small streak of pragmatism in these people, or perhaps put a better way, even an irrational broken clock hits the correct decision once every day.
And there's money to be made in Chinese capitalism, trading with China, buying them from China, selling to China. There must be a section of Britain's rulers who are more interested in the moolah.
Oh, absolutely. But weirdly, a lot of these politicians, when they talk about, and quite rightly when they talk about the many free trading agreements that the UK can sign with multiple countries outside of the EU once, if Brexit actually happens, they always stop short of saying the C word. They talk about India and Pakistan, I say good. They talk about Canada and the US, Australia, good. They talk about multiple countries in Africa. Occasionally they'll mention Southeast Asia, but they'll never mention China.
Or Russia.
And I suppose that sort of answers the second half of that open question.
Russia is the biggest economy in Europe. It's the biggest country in Europe. Moscow's the biggest city in Europe.
They're pumping the gas and oil.
Russia's economy is booming. It is energy rich. But they never mentioned that it's a country we could do business with. Even though Mrs. Thatcher, the Iron Lady herself, was more than happy to do business with the communist leader of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev. Here's Nicola in Swindon. Go ahead, Nicola.
Good evening to you, George.
Good evening.
Can I come back to an earlier thing you covered, which was about Pride, the chap from the Highlands who expressed horror that they might have a Pride march there or a Pride event.
They might break into doing the gay Gordons. Oh, no, wait. It's the straight people that do the gay Gordons.
Yes, but they're a great event because they bring families together. They bring the community together and people leave their prejudice behind and you don't get any trouble at the events. The police love them because they're a good, friendly event, and I cannot understand why this man.
I've never heard of any trouble at them.
No, you don't get trouble. I mean, you think of the number of people who go, say, to the Brighton one. There's thousands of people that are all moved there quite easily by train, and there's never problems with great throngs of people. No trouble, no violence, nothing. They're a good example of how an event should go, and I cannot see why this man threw his hands up in horror.
Well, it takes all sorts. Nicola, he's a Highland gentleman, maybe a little conservative on these matters, but you're pushing at an open door here, mate. So thank you very much indeed.
And thank you for letting me speak on it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
George.
You're welcome. Now, breaking news: the William Patrick Hitler of Upper Stanhope Street, Liverpool story is absolutely true. And there's loads on it in the on the internet. And I have never heard that story before. And I spend a lot of time in Liverpool. So I'm elevating Scouser Larsky to a professorship. He is now the professor of our Liverpool faculty. And, by the way, he fought on our side in the war.
Oh, good for him.
William became a US citizen, and when World War II broke out, he joined the United States Navy, fighting for his new country in the Pacific in 1944. He was later discharged for a shrapnel wound in 1946, and there's a picture of him in his US Navy uniform. What an absolutely fascinating nugget to stumble upon in a conversation. And there's an artist's impression of what they both look like, and you can see the family similarity. David is in Keighley. He's on the line, and up next. Go ahead, David.
Hello, George, and hello, Adam.
Hello.
I really love your show.
Thank you.
It gives me full of optimism. If I'm old enough to remember when there was real broadcasting, but yours could be your show really pulls me full of hope. You, Adam, and Vanessa Beeley. In the context of Syria, are my favourite journalists.
She's excellent. She's
of
excellent.
Course, Jimmy
Yes.
But I'm thinking I'm quite a Russophile, as well as the communist, the Soviet era. Russia has always been a great. We're rivals in the 19th century. What I want to get to the point. It's a bit left field. What do you think are the chances of us becoming an ally again, as we were in 1941 with Russia?
Well,
that'd be great for Britain.
This is the ultimate open door that you're pushing at with me. Adam is not so Russophilic as you and I, so I'll let him answer it first.
Well, if you're asking what the chances are, I think the chances are very low. There's a systematic culture that exists in Britain that says you can't have peace with Russia, which I want. You can't have trade with Russia. I want trade with everyone. That's my libertarian side, and I think my practical side showing. And that you can't cooperate on certain issues of national security, aka terrorism. I think that these are three very important areas where countries like Britain and indeed the US can cooperate with Russia. Should it happen? Yes. Will it happen? Probably not.
Because we have presently no intention, David, of leaving NATO. And it's NATO that is the problem. There's a number of things that a lot of people in my lifetime have got wrong. If I had £1 for everybody I heard say that NATO was set up as a response to the creation of the Warsaw Pact, I'd be very rich. NATO was set up many years before the Warsaw Pact was established. And NATO has become a juggernaut of in itself, with its own self-interest. A huge, bloated apparatus, gigantic military spending budgets. And when everyone's dressed up, they have to find somewhere to go. So where have they gone? They've gone in defiance of the promise that the West, President Reagan, Mrs. Thatcher, made to Gorbachev. A clear promise. They promised there would be no encroachment on Russia's borders by NATO. And all of those promises have been broken. And now NATO sits on the border with heavy military power on practically every one of Russia's borders, Adam.
That's absolutely right. And I think one of the great tragedies is that the Soviet Union collapsed rather than reformed. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping, who was the paramount leader of China between that year and 1992 in many ways until his death, he decided that he wanted to modernize the economy, allow people to develop wealth, but within a centralized framework, all about compromise. I mean, one of my favorite quotes of all all time is when Dong said, "I don't care if a cat is black or white, so long as it chases mice." Instead, Russia just committed collective suicide, and this led to to this day, an unsolved refugee crisis in parts of the former Soviet Union. It led to a 1990s where problems of alcohol, prostitution, suicide, and all sorts of social and medical ills, and of course financial and economic ills that didn't exist before. Even at the most imperfect periods of the Soviet Union, the 1990s were uniquely grim for Russia.
It was the biggest fall in life expectancy ever experienced by any country in any period of history. Last word to you, David.
A debt of an irredeemable sense of debt to the Russian people, the Soviet people.
Me too,
27 million lives. That is irredeemable.
Mm-hmm.
So I shall always feel loyal to Russia.
Well, we don't need to be loyal to it. We ought to be fraternal to it.
Exactly,
and when we were fraternal to it, it was our finest hour.
Yes, indeed it was. And I feel that the people who have been governors now for, 37 years, have been the sort of people who would have welcomed Hess.
Well, you may well be right. You may well be right. David, thanks for that. Ryan says, no, I've done that one. David Leviscont says, I do hope that Trump fires Bolton. He's a big part of the swamp. It is one of life's mysteries, isn't it, Adam, that all the things that Trump said he was against are personified in this little wicked Mr. Pastry.
Yes, indeed. And I think one of the big problems was this Mueller report, which Trump called the witch hunt, because he campaigned on a bit of peace and a bit of reconciliation, not with everyone, mind you, not with Iran, but he did campaign for peace and reconciliation with some, and then they went after him. And because of that, I think he needed to balance that out in his own strategic way of thinking with people who on these foreign policy issues were the opposite, and you can't get further apart. I mean, have John Bolton and the very concepts of reconciliation and peace ever occupied the same postcode? I don't think so. But what's dangerous about him, unlike a lot of these neocons, is that he knows the location to the specific latitude and longitude of every country he wants to destroy. So he's not stupid, but he is quite dangerous.
Similar question from Mal in Belfast. Ask Adam, does he think that Trump will ever drain the swamp and close all the tax loopholes, seeing that from 1985 to 1995, he lost over $1 billion and paid no tax for 8 of those 10 years, saying yesterday by tweet, you always wanted to show losses and renegotiate with banks. It was sport. Do you think his reluctance to show his taxes now are a sign that he and his hired friends could be exploiting the markets and America blind, and will we ever find out?
All rich people will exploit taxation loopholes as much as they can, and therefore it's the job of government to make them more difficult to exploit, because exploiting something legal is different than doing something illegal, and this very poor state of the press, particularly in the US, has let that important fact sort of fall by the wayside. As for whether Trump will drain the swamp, I think he certainly can't do it before 2020. That appears to be self-evident by now, but if he wins another term, and I'll say it again on air that I think he's going to win fairly comfortably in 2020, he may swish the waters around in the swamp sufficiently to expose the entrails of some of the underwater monsters.
Let's take a break. Adam, a lot of people are asking why you don't like the Russian government.
This particular one? Well, several reasons. You talked about a large economy. It's large in the way that Mike Pompeo is large, as opposed to in the way that Michael Jordan or Muhammad Ali were large. And the problem is a systemic culture of corruption that has improved since the 90s. Again, it couldn't have possibly got much worse, but it hasn't gone away. And it is the people that are suffering. It's a country that at the end of the 1970s was decades ahead of China China in terms of infrastructure and industry and production techniques. And now it's so far behind the leaders, not just of the Northern Hemisphere, but of the G20 in total. And the problem is the country could do better, but the political leadership, in spite of the bells and whistles, it hasn't got the vision to actually think big, but actually do it in the way that China did after Dong. And the other problem is there's a bit of self-satisfaction, and that's dangerous in any political system.
Now, Yanni is in Swansea. He's got an Ask Adam question on 5G. Go ahead, Yanni.
Oh, hi, George.
Hi.
How's it going?
Good. Yeah, we're very, very nice to hear from you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to speak to you again. I just was intrigued because you Adam brought up the idea of 5G in the US and in competition with China, and it's all been in the news lately with Huawei and so on. And just recently, I've met some people who are quite into this notion of questioning the safety of 5G and the public health issues. And I don't really know a hell of a lot about it, and I'm only just coming to understand some of it. But I do know that there are big questions about it, and I just wondered...
Do you mean security questions?
Well, no. Well, okay, there are several levels. The first one is the public health thing in terms of the radio.
Oh, on 5G as a concept. Yeah, I've got you.
Yeah, that's right. Because it's a far greater a greater frequency. The distance that the data can travel is shorter. So therefore there has to be a hell of a lot more antennae. There has to because it just can't travel as far. And so it appears that there could potentially be an antenna virtually in every street, and people will have to, without any consent, almost, have one outside their house and so on. And I know that there is a bit of there's an undercurrent, there's an upwelling of objection to this sort of thing.
Well, there is. I do hear that, Adam. I don't agree with it myself.
Nor do I.
I don't think that 5G radiation is any more dangerous than any other radiation, no more, no less. And I think it's a substantial step forward. I normally lean towards science rather than away from it. What's your view on 5G as an idea?
Well, I agree with everything you said, and as an idea, I think we need to focus on how far from harming life it's going to save a lot of human life. Just a few months ago, and this should have been on the front page of every, I was going to say newspaper, but website in the world, a Chinese surgeon in one part of the country successfully performed a brain operation on an Alzheimer's patient in another part of the country. He was sitting behind the controllers, much like one would do, let's call it a high-stakes video game, and the robotic arms in the operating theatre operated on the man's brain. The surgery went completely well. The man was even interviewed by the Chinese media. He said he's feeling much better, and this has the potential to save thousands upon thousands of lives in places like Africa, in the developing world, where it's not always easy to get a very highly qualified surgeon out, but if you have these robots there and the surgeon can conduct the operation remotely, I think that is going to be a big game changer and in an incredibly positive way for humanity.
And particularly in Africa, where connectivity is poor yet resource-rich countries,
yes,
with big populations, huge area. I mean, an uptick in connectivity has got to be a good thing, isn't it?
Well, already in Africa, they're more sophisticated in terms of payment options than in some parts of Europe. Because they don't have the old-fashioned infrastructure, most of their payments are done on mobile phones, even though a lot of these phones are just sort of the old-fashioned non-smartphone kind of mobile phones. And so the disadvantages that Africa had for so long, far too long, frankly, 5G can be turned into win-win advantages when you say, look, we don't even have old infrastructure to tear apart. We're going to have our Chinese partners come in with 5G. It's going to revolutionize health, education. People will be able to interact with highly qualified, great experts from around the world, even in rural schools. So 5G is about a lot more than downloading films and music and conducting commerce, though that's important too. But much more importantly, for education and for medicine, it's going to be a great leap forward, to coin the phrase.
To coin a phrase. Yanni, last word to you.
Yeah, I agree with all those things, but there are many things that we don't know. But what we do know is that the public consultation has been very poor. The other thing that we do know is that the US and China are racing ahead at a sprint to get ahead of the game of each other, which means that they don't really have any regard for testing and researching this adequately because they're in a rush, and that's a fact. So regardless of what either of you are saying about those potential benefits, there may also be people who lose out as a result of this. The other thing as well is that one of the things that it seems to be underpinning or driving it is not so much pressing ahead with medical technology and so forth, but for corporate interests, for the rollout of the Internet of Things.
Yeah, well, of course, that's the world we live in, Yanni. But you can't, we can't not do things because the people doing them are doing them to profit. If they're good things, they should be done.
Yes, but what I'm saying is, when there's a hell of a lot of money to be made, a lot of corners are cut, and public health has, in the past, often come off second best. There are many precedents of that, and I'm just saying there doesn't seem to be, from what I can see, a precautionary principle on this, and it does seem that there are a number of very good scientists that are questioning this. There are some very good lectures to look at it.
Okay, well, no doubt people will look them out after your call. Thanks, Yanni. You made a good argument, even though I don't agree with it. I was the only man in the country that was astounded at the money paid for 4G bandwidth. I was totally unpersuaded that people would watch things on their telephones, and now I do little else.
I remember when mobile phones were becoming en vogue, I thought, I've already got one at home. And now, obviously, it's the tool.
It is. Now, Dean Butler says, George, you promised me live on Moats over the last couple of years to give me your opinion on Ben Shapiro and what really happened with the USS Liberty. Can I cash that in tonight? Not at 9:54, Dean. The latter point I'm not able to deal with. All I'll say about Ben Shapiro is he still a thing after my fellow Scottish council house dwelling working class Scotsman Andrew Neil tore him to pieces live on the BBC earlier today. And Lizzie, my dear friend, she's a professor too, Lizzie. She says, spot on concerning the Syrians, George. They are the most cultured people on the planet. And Mark says, I've had ME for 30 years. I also went blind 10 years ago. My ME is far more disabling and has had a far more devastating effect on my life than blindness ever has. That's from Mark in Castleford. And the Red Resistance says, here's a list for you. Instances of the United States overthrowing, this is going to be a long list.
Do we have time?
Or attempting to overthrow a foreign government since the Second World War. China, 1949 to the early 60s. Albania, 1949 to 1953. But then he runs up against the character limitations and can't go any further.
They'll need to invent a new version of Twitter.
It would have needed 100 tweets, Red Resistance, to fully adumbrate, good word in present company, to fully adumbrate the list. Maybe next week we'll return to that point and just go through the lists. It is worth pointing out that Iran has never attacked another country for 300 years.
Indeed, and Iran is one of the longest continually operational, in the sense of being self-governing, civilizations in the world. You can put China up there, and there's a few others, but it's an ancient, ancient place. It's been around long before the cowboy culture of John Bolton and his friends. So if he thinks that Iran is going to just be a pushover, much like with Russia, even people that hated Stalin fought life and death to defend their country, their culture, their homeland in the Great Patriotic War. The same is true today in Iran.
That is absolutely the case. I know Iran well. I've only been there, 2-3 times, but I know I had a long conversation with an Iranian gentleman in London earlier today. Now, he was not fasting for Ramadan. He's not religious at all. He dislikes the regime in Iran so much that as a 16-year-old, he fled the Iranian Revolution and has been living in Europe and now in Britain ever since the revolution in 1979. Now, he hates the system, the mullahs, the religious nature of the Iranian regime, and is not a young man. He would return to Iran immediately if a war was waged against his country. He's probably listening now. I hope I haven't said too much, my friend. He would die to defend Iran, not to defend Khomeini or the mullahs or the regime. He would die to defend Iran. Think about that, President Trump. Because there's many millions of Iranians just like him. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. And if you enjoyed it, come back next week at the same time, same place.